This is College Football with Sam. Welcome back, everyone. And today I am going to be showing you my Ohio State versus Indiana deep dive that is inspired by hours of poring over film, advanced analytics, and going back and forth between the Hoosiers and the Buckeyes here, pondering my thoughts on a top five matchup where I think both teams can give the other significant issues. So before we dive deep, look under the hood, look under the microscope, and I give you a revised prediction because I've changed my mind on some things. I present matchup advantages, edges, wrinkles that I didn't have the time to talk about in my initial preview and prediction video. Link to that is in the pinned comment if you're curious. And just some other things like advanced data that I also didn't have the time to present to you. I ask you to help College Football with Sam to score a touchdown, to make a big play for the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube, to help us become the best college football channel on YouTube, to make a game-breaking catch like Ohio State's Jeremiah Smith or Indiana's Elijah Surratt, or to power in the end zone like Ohio State's Quinshon Judkins or Indiana's Justice Ellison, and subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, comment your thoughts on this matchup down below. Your score prediction, any comments you have about this deep dive, any points of agreement, points of disagreement, something that you have seen analytically or on film that really stands out to you in favor of either team. And also share this video around. Join our Discord server via the link in the pinned comment where we talk college football 24/7, especially on Saturdays. We're trying to hit 1,000 members by the end of the regular season. And speaking of milestones, we reached 20,000 subscribers recently, and we will be doing a giveaway to celebrate that at the end of the regular season. So please, again, hit the subscribe button and click the notification bell so that you can get notified when I release new content, and that way you won't miss our giveaway at the end of the regular season. And if you want to support the channel monetarily, you can sign up as a paid member of the Patreon page to donate to the channel, donate via Super Chat down in the comment section below, or purchase merchandise from our merchandise store. And the link to the Patreon page and the merchandise store is in the pinned comment at the top of the comment section. But let's go. You've seen on my screen here my original prediction with some points that I laid out for why I picked Ohio State to win 31-27. Indiana, I thought, would lead this game in run offense and defense, that they would be the better team on the ground on both sides of the football, but that Ohio State would win via explosive plays because of players like Quinshon Judkins, Travion Henderson, Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate. Emeka Egbuka is more of their reliable receiver who they target to just pick up first downs, but he can still be explosive as well. And also explosive plays on defense. Cody Simon blowing up the offense on a play to get a sack, or Caleb Downs maybe blowing up a critical fourth down with his awesome pursuit and tackling. I thought that at the end of the day, Ohio State would win because of big plays, because they made the bigger plays than Indiana did, even though Indiana was maybe winning in the more traditional Big Ten way, running the ball better and shutting down the run better. And some of that's on some questions about Ohio State's offensive line, how Indiana's really overperformed on the D-line. That was my original prediction here. And that eventually Ohio State would outpace Indiana. That not that Curt Cignetti's team would get impatient because I think they're too well coached to do that, but Ohio State would just be able to score at a moment's notice, slowly wear them down with their depth, and therefore Indiana would eventually make some mistakes that they're more prone to make because they would have to create sustainable drives to score, whereas Ohio State can just score one play 75 yards because they're the more explosive team. And also, finally, that Ohio State's defense would bend, and they would give up yards, and they would give up points, and there would probably be people on Twitter calling for Jim Knowles to be fired. But at the moment it needed to step up, it would step up, and that they would force Indiana to kick enough field goals, to drive down the field methodically enough to where Indiana would have to make more plays on offense. They would have to play at a higher level in order to not have to punt or not fail a fourth down, and eventually Ohio State's defense would tire out Indiana's offense a bit, or at least prevent it from scoring more points than Ohio State, resulting in a Buckeye victory. I've changed my mind on some of this. On other things, I haven't changed my mind at all. But Let's look at what the power ratings say, really rewind and preview this game again from a different perspective with new information. So I've collected power ratings from Football Power Index, from S&P Plus, from Kelly Ford, from Stats of War on Twitter, Parker Fleming, his CFI. I forget, it's College Football Insiders. That's what it stands for. Nearly had a gaffe there. The College Football Nerds model, and also my potential power index. I've lined up 6 power ratings and have factored in home field advantage. Most of them have already factored in home field advantage automatically. My model works a little bit different with home field advantage. College Football Nerds model doesn't even include home field advantage. And home field advantage matters a lot at times. Other times it doesn't. In an environment with the horseshoe at play, with 100,000 fans of a passionate fan base like Ohio State's, it's much more likely to matter than not. But just wanted to give a little bit of explanation there. FPI thinks that Ohio State will win this game by 10.7 points. S&P Plus says about 12.9. Kelly Ford says about 11.3. This is simply taking the projected point spreads on a neutral field for most of these power ratings and then adding home field advantage to OSU. For the CFI power rating, College Football Insiders, I don't know how that exactly works, but their model spits out Ohio State winning by 3.4 points. College Football Nerds model says Ohio State by about 10.8 points. My potential power index, which functions more like FPI, S&P Plus, and I believe Kelly Ford, then again, I'm not perfect with my knowledge about how all of these models work. Potential power says that Ohio State should win this game by about 7.7 points. Previously, potential power said Ohio State should win this game by about 8.5 points, or at least that's what they should win by, not what they will win by, because Saturday will play itself out. I tried my best to factor in the McLaughlin injury. I just compared his grade on PFF compared to Carson Hinsman's grade on PFF because he's going to be the starting center. Hinsman has been doing well this year, not as good as McLaughlin. So Seth McLaughlin's injury did not impact Ohio State's margin of victory or predicted margin of victory all that much. Simply impacted it by about 0.8 points in IU's favor. Be praying for Seth McLaughlin. It's the same thing with Drew Evans for Indiana, for Josh Simmons with Ohio State. These 2 teams, have had 3 critical offensive line injuries that really present matchup advantages for the opposing defenses, and we'll talk about that in this video. Overall, though, power ratings right now say that Ohio State should win. They are clearly favored to win by really anywhere from a field goal at worst from College Football Insiders to about as close to 13 points or really 2 touchdowns as you can get from S&P Plus. So the power ratings clearly favor the Ohio State Buckeyes here. Now, let's look at advanced analytics individually, separate from power ratings, because power ratings kind of feed off of advanced analytics, some talent here and there, maybe coaching rankings or, different matchups from position groups or success rates. And then, of course, there's also, when it comes to these advanced analytics, typically the teams that have more blue chip talent are going to be more dominant than the teams that don't. You look at Ohio State, their points per play margin is 0.414. Indiana's is 0.374. Indiana, their expected points added margin is 0.233. Ohio State's is 0.299. These teams are both in the top 10 in these categories. In fact, they're both in the top 5, I'm pretty sure. In points per play margin, I know that. I think IU may be outside of the top 5, but inside of the top 10 in expected points added margin. When you look at yards per point margin, which is simply the difference between how many yards your opponent needs to gain to score on you versus how many yards you need to gain to score on your opponent, you want to be in the positives here because that means your defense forces opponents to gain more yards per single point they score on you compared to how many yards your offense needs to score 1 point on your opponent. Ohio State is an 11.8 yards per point margin, which is just insane. That means Ohio State's opponents have to gain basically 1 extra first down of yardage or more to score the same amount of points as Ohio State's offense is going to score on them. For Indiana, that total is still pretty high. It's 7.4, though, so lower than OSU's. Indiana's average scoring margin is plus 25.2 per game. Ohio State's is plus 27.9. These statistics, I will tell you the majority of them because I got them from teamrankings.com, does not factor in Indiana's dominant 77-point hanging on Western Illinois. Doesn't count that. If you count that in, a lot of this doesn't really change all that much. Maybe they'd be ahead of OSU in some areas, but it's against an FCS team. It was their weakest team on the schedule, so it's not that big of a deal that that information was left out. Their yards per play margin, how many yards per play more does their offense gain compared to what their defense allows? Ohio State is a 2.9 yards per play margin, gaining an average of about 3 extra yards per one of their plays compared to one of their opponent's plays. For Indiana, that's 2.2, so closer to 2. You're seeing that both of these teams are dominant, that Ohio State is a little bit more dominant than IU. It's not a huge separation, but it's clear. It's noticeable. Indiana has a 52.3% success rate on offense compared to OSU's 48.8%, and Ohio State's defense allows a success rate of 34.8% compared to IU's 35.4%. So in terms of success rate, these teams are pretty close. Ohio State has the better defensive success rate. Indiana has the better offensive success rate. In game control, these teams are top 5. Ohio State is second. Indiana is 5th. And game control simply reflects how would the average top 25 team perform with your schedule. And that's for every team. You can plug in Indiana, Ohio State, Missouri, Michigan, Oregon, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and then based off of how they think the average top 25 team would do with all those schedules compared to whatever team they're plugging in has performed with their schedule, they rank all of these teams. Ohio State's second, Indiana is 5th. Then there's average in-game win probability, which measures your average in-game win probability per play, but adjusted for strength of schedule. And even when you adjust for strength of schedule, Indiana's second in average in-game win probability. Ohio State is 6th. So game control and average in-game win probability are adjusted for strength of schedule. And look at Indiana. They're still top 5. College Football Nerds has Indiana's scoring offense even when you adjust for relative performance, which is really just cross-referencing as much as possible. So trying to adjust for Indiana's weaker strength of schedule, Indiana's still top 10 in scoring offense. They have one of the best scoring offenses in all of college football, and their defense is still respectably high too. They're top 25, if not top 20 in College Football Nerds relative performance scoring defense. So Ohio State's dominant. Ohio State is one of the best teams this season, and I want to emphasize that. They're very good. In spite of some of their injuries, some of their warts and issues, they're elite relative to this season. Could be elite if they can come together with their A game at every position in light of the previous even 5 seasons. This is a down year in football, I think. It's, I think, a good year for competition, down year for being an elite team at the top. But OSU has a ton of talent. I think that they have a lot of explosiveness and potential at other positions that has yet to be unlocked here. And they're an elite team, and I want to emphasize that, even with some of their issues. Indiana has some issues, for sure. And they faced a weak strength of schedule. Yes. And they lack blue chip talent compared to other teams that are in their tier analytically. Of course, that's a fact. That's something that Indiana has to deal with. It's something they have to negate, and it's something that their opponents have to try to take advantage of. But Indiana is not 2022 TCU. They are not 2021 Michigan State. In fact, they are analytically better than 2023 Washington, even when you adjust for strength of schedule. Mainly because they've been blowing out everyone they've played. And even in that Michigan game, it was a lot like Ohio State-Nebraska, I thought, where Ohio State led Nebraska by a respectable margin at the half. They looked like the better team. It looked like they were just going to pull away, not have their A game, but, pull away, win by double digits, probably not cover the spread or maybe cover the spread, but not look great, but still win. And then I think due to dull play calling, I think looking ahead a bit to Penn State, Nebraska believed it could win, nearly won, took the lead, and then Ohio State, finally said enough's enough. They took out the whatever tool you use to like kill a cow before gutting it, and they just put it to Nebraska's head, dead. And then Indiana versus Michigan was kind of the same story. Indiana was very conservative. They looked very uninterested, very casual. They still dominated Michigan in the first half. Michigan came back in the second half, but Indiana put them away. What I want to do here is give a position-by-position comparison using my power ratings and also a bit of my opinion here. I think that Ryan Day is obviously, and we'll start with coaching, matchup advantages, and just more broad topics or off-the-field topics. Then we'll get into the roster stuff, and this will progress throughout the video for the next several minutes. So grab whatever drink is your favorite, drink responsibly if it's alcohol, and grab whatever snack you love, because we're going to talk some football here as we've been now for the past 15 minutes. Ryan Day, it's obvious, better head coach. When you look at game management, I can't measure who's been the better game manager this year. Ohio State's played in bigger moments, but they also have better talent, so their game management isn't, theoretically at least, because sometimes talent is more perceived than viewed properly. Like sometimes stars just don't pan out or they're not developed well, but that's not the case with OSU. You can clearly see that OSU develops their star players well, and they're well coached. But coaching well at OSU is, on an average basis, not going to be as important as coaching at Indiana if you want to win at the same level, or at least in terms of dominate your schedules that you're given in the same way, because OSU is that much more talent. So in relationship to game management, Ohio State is the edge because they've played better teams. Indiana has the edge because they're about as dominant as OSU. Not as much when you factor in strength of schedule, but still pretty close, and yet they have that much less talent. And their roster doesn't have the same chemistry, or shouldn't have the same chemistry built up as OSU's does. A lot of their players transferred from James Madison, yes, but they have some Indiana holdovers. Curtis Rourke came from Ohio. The job that both of these coaches have done this year in their own right is extremely impressive. I'm going with Ryan Day here because he is a known. He's been at Ohio State since 2019. We know his strengths. We know his weaknesses. We know his strengths massively outnumber his weaknesses. And Curt Cignetti is just a little bit more of an unknown here. I think Indiana's offensive staff is better. I know that Chip Kelly's, I think, a great play caller. And Ohio State has a coach like Brian Hartline, who's done an elite job coaching and developing and recruiting and scouting receivers. However, what Indiana has done with inferior talent drastically across the board, and yet offensively they're actually performing better than Ohio State in multiple categories, that's something that's something we have to give props to here. It's the same thing with Ohio State's defensive staff, who I think is better than Indiana's. Indiana's defensive staff has done very, very well. But the defenses that Indiana has played on their schedule are closer to the defenses that Ohio State has played on their schedule compared to the offenses Ohio State has played versus the offense that Indiana has played. Indiana's offense has destroyed Nebraska's defense, who very much limited Ohio State's offense. Even when you factor in that was a big game for Indiana, and for OSU there's a bit of a pushover. Indiana, I think, in that first half did a lot more damage to Michigan's defense than the final score indicated. And they, with a backup quarterback and a pretty vanilla game plan, casually worked a Washington secondary that is among one of the better secondaries in all of football. You look at OSU, though, and they've played Oregon's offense. They have played Penn State's offense, which are both top 10 in efficiency per ESPN. Indiana hasn't played anything close to that. And Ohio State is still significantly better in advanced analytics on defense than Indiana is. It's not significant as in Indiana's 50th and Ohio State's first. It's more so Ohio State is first and by a pretty decent margin compared to number 2 or number 3 in a lot of categories. And Indiana's anywhere from like 25th to maybe 5th in some areas. So offensively, staff-wise, pardon me for tumbling over my words there, I would give that to the Hoosiers. Defensively and head coach-wise, CEO, I would lean OSU. I think Indiana has better run blocking and better pass blocking than OSU. And that ties into the fact that I think Indiana right now has better guards, better tackles, and a better center. Indiana, because of the 2 major injuries to Ohio State, and again, be praying for Simmons and McLaughlin, and also Indiana's Drew Evans at guard. Because of those injuries, you'd rather have one major injury on your O-line than two. Ohio State recruits better than IU. We know that. But one of Ohio State's worst recruited and developed positions over the past several years has been the O-line. And they have sustained 2 body blows. 2. And about 5 different shuffles on the offensive line in terms of starts. I think IU is better there. Watching them on film, Indiana is more consistent. And it's also abundantly clear that Indiana's offensive line is not bailed out as much by the talent they have as OSU's is. I mean, OSU is a lot more talent on the outside. That's why I have them rated higher at running back and at wide receiver. And wide receiver and running back are heavily in OSU's favor. And quarterback, even though I lean Indiana because Rourke is rated higher in ESPN's QBR versus Howard, Rourke, I think, is more consistent in his throwing. And although Howard has been mobile, Rourke can be mobile. And I think that's a wrinkle that Ohio State's defense needs to pay attention to. I think Indiana is going to run Rourke. He did run at Ohio where he was in an option offense. I think he can function as a runner in a game like this. They just, whether it's they don't want him to run, they don't feel like they need him to run, they were hiding it for the OSU game this whole time, I don't know. He just hasn't ran the ball all that much. So I give Rourke a slight edge and an edge at tight end in the offensive line. So I think pass blocking, run blocking goes to IU. I think as it stands right now, the analytics would disagree with me because analytics take in every game. But over the past month, I think that a team would rather have Indiana's rushing offense, where it's a guaranteed 3 to 4, maybe 5 yards a carry and maybe an occasional pop, compared to OSU, where you maybe get a big run because your athletes are that good, but you may also surrender several TFLs if you're facing a team that's well tackled. Indiana's rush offense is more consistent. I think in a big game, consistency is key in running the football. A pass offense goes to Ohio State when you have running backs that can catch the ball like OSU's, when you have a wide receiver like Jeremiah Smith, then Carnell Tate, Emeka Egbuka, Brandon Inniss as a really good receiver that is a backup and can be rotated in if needed. And Howard has been very accurate, and he's been getting better game over game over game at passing the football. Maybe some of it is his opponents. The fact he's been playing Purdue and Northwestern, but still, he is making NFL-level throws there. And I got to give credit where it's due. I think that even in spite of some of the issues in pass protection and some of the shuffling, Howard has gotten better at passing the football. I thought he would just be a top 25, maybe top 20 quarterback beginning of the season. Yeah, he's top 5 right now. And for Curtis Rourke, I didn't even think he was going to be a top 25 QB. And right now, he is a top 5 quarterback. Switching over to the defense, I think Indiana has the better run defense. They're better statistically. When you look at college football nerds' relative performance, Ohio State is better, but Indiana is not far behind at all, even factoring in strength of schedule. And I do believe that Ohio State's explosivity on offense and also some things that involve the opponents that just some of the matchups they've had help benefit their run offense and hide some things there. As for Indiana's pass defense, the reason Ohio State's ahead in pass defense, even though Indiana leads the Buckeyes in multiple categories there, is Indiana hasn't faced a passing defense that I could say with confidence is competent or is capable of being competent for 4 quarters. The closest is Washington, and they did rather well, but that's a 1-game sample size. Ohio State's played Oregon, and yes, they got burned, but Oregon is very good when they're on their A game in the passing offense. They faced Penn State, who in every game has been pretty competent through the air and has had explosive plays through the air. They shut down Penn State's passing offense. The only passing offense they had in that Penn State game was Tyler Warren, and they targeted him sometimes on one-on-ones and succeeded. Other times they failed because Lathan Ransom and Jordan Hancock and Caleb Downs, their safeties and nickelback, are just that good. So defensively, the rushing defense goes IU, passing defense goes OSU. For the outside edge, that is, getting to the outside in your runs or deep attacks through the passing attack, really explosive plays. I would heavily lean toward OSU for the inside, really for a push along the offensive line or The same thing on the D line, including scheme there. I would lean Indiana. Ohio State has more depth because of their better recruiting, and also they have more X Factor players. They have more alien athletes. Indiana may have an alien athlete. Like Pons, I know is small, but he's been exceptionally good, high football IQ, really good player. Might be like Indiana's Mikey Sainra still. And then I have to say some of their wide receivers have performed very well, and they have big physical offensive linemen, Indiana does. But quickly, because I've talked a lot about the staffs and the matchups and tying that in here, I think quarterback with Rourke, you slightly go IU there. Running back with Henderson and Judkins. I mean, look at this, for example. This is why, even though I think Indiana's rushing offense is better right now, or at least is something that you would more so desire in a big game or to establish game control, Judkins and Henderson have been held at times to little to no gains at different games over the past month. Judkins is still averaging 6 yards per carry. Henderson's still averaging 7.4. Henderson is 662 rushing yards. Judkins is 723. Judkins has 102 receiving yards. Henderson has 105, so they can contribute through the air as well. Henderson has evolved into an awesome blocker of, biblical proportions. So, yeah, I think that's pretty obvious. And they're doing it with an offensive line that has been physical at times and sometimes has put together a good game, but at other moments looks like it's about to fall apart and that it's on its last leg. And they are doing that in spite of that adversity. So I really like Judkins. I really like Henderson especially. Henderson's one of my favorite players in all of college football. Jeremiah Smith is awesome at wide receiver. Elijah Surratt and Omar Cooper Jr., Miles Price, they're good, but Ohio State's receivers are all likely going to be first rounders at some point or NFL players. I'd prefer Zach Horton over G. Scott Jr. at tight end. Mike Caddick, I think, will be a better center than Carson Hinsman. He's been one of the Big Ten's best centers all year. And Hinsman was okay last year. I think was a bit underrated last year at times, even though he had some struggles. And he looks good this year, but switching back to center will be a slight bit of a change. And he's been good at guard, but not as good as Caddick has been at center. You look at guard. Guard is difficult because Tyler Steffens for Indiana has really struggled, but he's only played in one game, and Bray Lynch has been amazing. For Ohio State, they're breaking in at guard Austin Saraveld, and then they have Tegra Shabola on the other side. Guard could be a push, could even be OSU, but I'm leaning Indiana because I think Steffens is going to have a better game out of the bye. And Indiana, they at least have a whole game with their current O-line arrangement under their belt along with a bye week. OSU is switching up there and starting someone who has some starts, but earlier in the year against inferior competition in Saraveld. And by inferior, I don't mean inferior Big Ten teams. I mean like MAC caliber teams. So a bit of a difference. Like Washington or Michigan State, those teams are not, they're not great. I mean, Washington or Michigan on their best days are good at the very best. Could be bad. Michigan State's anywhere from terrible to above average at the very best. But they're still better than Western Michigan and certainly better than Akron, which is just, Akron's a mess. And then tackle, Donovan Jackson's been at tackle. He has been great at times, but he is not the typical ideal tackle build. So a speed rusher like we saw in Abdul Carter can get around him. And that wouldn't be a problem if Indiana didn't have Michael Kamara. And then Josh Fryer's been a bit up and down as well. So I'd give Indiana the offensive line, tight end, quarterback, but OSU is sizably ahead at running back, wide receiver. At defensive tackle, I'd lean OSU. Defensive end, I would lean Indiana. I think IU's DNs have been more productive, particularly Kamara compared to OSU's DNs. At D tackle, I think Indiana has slightly better depth, but they're not the same size that OSU is. OSU's starters at D tackle, in my opinion, are better than Indiana starters at defensive tackle. And they have a higher octane juice and potential to them, and they've played very well. Linebacker, I'd go to OSU. I honestly would. They tackle well. They're smart. Sonny Styles is coming on. Indiana has good linebackers that also tackle well, especially in run defense, but I'd lean OSU there. Corner with D'Angelo Pons. I would lean IU because Burke and Igbinosun have had their struggles. They've had their big plays, but they've also had their struggles this year. And at safety, how couldn't you go OSU with Caleb Downs and Lathan Ransom? And lastly, special teams, I would go with Indiana. Just slightly, though. These teams don't have that big of an advantage over each other in multiple categories. They are very, very close. Let's take a look at Ohio State's defense versus Indiana's offense. Take a look at the matchup there, starting with the defensive line and the offensive line. Defensive line of OSU and offensive line of IU. What the numbers signify at each position is the grade of, depending on the amount of snaps. I think it was, if I saw anything of any player that had over 200 snaps, I think I factored in their PFF grade. And PFF is not perfect. I don't agree with all these grades, but it's still interesting. And I think it can show some matchup advantages that each team may have. You look at Indiana's offense. Their two tackles in Trey Wedig and Carter Smith look to not exactly match Jack Sawyer and GT Tuimoloau, but at least come very close. So pass rush for Ohio State, I would say you have to either look at Tyler Steffens for Indiana not having a good game because just 41 PFF grade. He was the weak link during the Michigan game, where a lot of Michigan's pass rush came through him, came from Kenneth Grant, Mason Graham, the D tackles getting on him. I would look for Ty Hamilton, the nose tackle, and Tyleik Williams, the defensive tackle. I would look for them to target him, for Jim Knowles to pay attention to that, to see that, and that would be a matchup advantage for OSU. But also, Mike Caddick for Indiana has a similar grade compared to these defensive tackles offensively as the D tackles do defensively. And on the other side, you have Bray Lynch, who's been a very good guard, good downfield blocker, does a good job in every way as an offensive lineman. So if Tyler Steffens steps up and has a good game, Indiana could hold their own or perhaps push OSU's D-line. If he has a bad game, Indiana's O-line will have a hole that they'll have to plug. They'll have to find some way to support him, maybe with their tight end, Zach Horton. Or maybe both will have a good game, but maybe one will push one or the other. I mean, they're both highly graded units, Ohio State's O-line, or Ohio State's D-line, and Indiana's offensive line. Curtis Rourke is a 91 overall at quarterback. No surprises there. Justice Ellison for Indiana, their starting running back, and Tyson Lawton, their second string running back, averaged out to an 80. You look at wide receiver Z for Indiana, Miles Cross, and X for Elijah Surratt, and Price is wide receiver Y in that slot position. Price and Omar Cooper Jr. both averaged out to an 81. Elijah Surratt is a 78, and Miles Cross and Omar Cooper Jr., 73. It was Miles Price and Keshawn Williams who averaged out to an 81. So when you look at IU's offense, I think the biggest advantage you see is Indiana's wide receivers against Ohio State's corners, Igbinosun and Denzel Burke, who received grades in the upper 60s or 70 right there. That is, I think, Indiana's biggest advantage, along with, quite honestly, their O-line over OSU's D-line if Steffens has a big game. But look at Ohio State's grades at linebacker. Sonny Styles is the 73 grade. Cody Simon's an 86. That's how good of a player Cody Simon is. He's having an awesome year, and I don't think that Indiana, and it's the same thing with OSU. I don't think either of these teams' tight ends are going to be having heydays against these linebackers like, let's say, Colston Loveland had against Ohio State's linebackers last year. Not just because Colston Loveland or a caliber tight end like him is not in this game, but because Ohio State's linebackers are getting better and better and better, I think, every game. At strong safety, Lathan Ransom's a 90, highest rated overall player on the defense. Caleb Downs is an 83. Personally, I think he should be higher. And then Jordan Hancock, who's at nickelback, he's an 81. So looking at Ohio State's defensive backfield here, a conclusion that I can draw from these matchups and also watching film is that IU will not get big explosive plays. If they do, it's going to be on the outside against these corners if Ohio State decides not to bring safety help. So could be wrong here because this is just analysis and Saturday will play itself out. But Jim Knowles, depending on how this game goes, I don't know if blitzing would be a smart idea here. I don't. I don't know if leaving your corners on an island against these wide receivers would be advisable, especially if Indiana's O-line is having problems with Tyler Steffens. Ohio State, with some of their struggles on the D-line, may still be able to get home or make IU uncomfortable with 4. And at that point, you let your offense eat. Your defense bends but doesn't break because IU's having issues on the offensive line, and then Ohio State wins. But there's also the fact that Indiana's been very good at being methodical and being aggressive and converting on 4th down and running for 3 yards in a cloud of dust. And if their O-line plays well or their receivers have a big game against some corners that are shaky, there are matchup advantages here that favor the Indiana Hoosiers. Let's take a look at Indiana's defense versus Ohio State's offense, and then we'll continue on with this deep dive. Indiana here, you got Michael Kamara, who's the 90 overall at defensive end. And then on his opposite side of defensive end, you have Linnell Carr Jr. Michael Kamara is the highest rated player on Indiana's defense, highest rated overall player. And he's done very well, almost has 10 sacks on the season. And I think that you look at Ohio State's left tackle here, Donovan Jackson, he could present some matchup advantages for the Hoosiers there, could present some problems for OSU. OSU's more stable at guard right now than IU, but I don't think they have the same type of upside as shown by their grades that are in the 60s. And center Carson Hinsman's been good, but not great. You look at right tackle with Josh Fryer, him up against Linnell Carr Jr. It's similar with Indiana's offensive tackles versus OSU's defensive ends. There isn't quite the same mismatch in favor of OSU on that side that there is on Indiana's side here, but it's not that far away, where the O-line can hold its own if it's schemed properly, if it has a good game. No surprises that Will Howard's an 87 or that Henderson and Judkins have averaged out to an 86. You look at these receivers, 85 is Jeremiah Smith right there. Wide receiver Y for Ohio State is Emeka Egbuka. And then wide receiver Z is Carnell Tate here. What Ohio State has an edge on at wide receiver could be corner, definitely because of a player like Jeremiah Smith. But you look at these other players at the wide receiver room and their grades, and Indiana's linebackers are not rated as highly as OSU's, 74 and 69 respectively for the 2 starters in Indiana's running back room. And those are Jalen Walker and Aiden Fisher. Where Ohio State has an advantage here, I think, is a little bit of big plays in the passing game. Not in the rushing game, because I think as the grades have shown, as the information I've given in my preview and prediction video have shown, and the information that I can give you again throughout this video, Indiana's rushing defense is really good, and OSU's shuffling a bit on the O-line. But Indiana's strong safety, free safety, and nickelback, up against wide receiver X, who's typically the explosive receiver, that is Jeremiah Smith. I think OSU can get a long touchdown or 2. They did it against Penn State. They were able to get some explosive plays against Oregon. They've been able to get explosive plays through the year against everyone because Smith is that good, and Howard is that good too. So Sean Asbury, Amari Farrell, and Terry Jones Jr. are going to have their work cut out for them, for sure. Again, I don't think tight ends for either of these teams are going to have a ton of success through the passing game unless their matchups are schemed to success. I think both linebacker groups have an advantage on both tight end groups, and both of these defensive lines, honestly, have an advantage against both of these offensive lines. So it's going to be very interesting. A lot of it will be not just who steps up, because I think a lot of that's coach speak, but a lot of which team schemes better, and also who has been developed better throughout the season at especially the trench positions, where Indiana, I think, has been exceptional with development this year. OSU's been a bit inconsistent, but so actually has Indiana. We'll talk about that here in a few seconds. And along the offensive line, both are sustaining injuries. So For the Hoosiers, being systemic and being methodical and controlling the game, I think they can do that with the matchup advantages they have. Comparing like their wide receivers to Ohio State's corners, or their offensive line against Ohio State's defensive line in some instances, depending on how Jim Knowles calls the game, but especially their receivers, I think, in short and intermediate yardage. For OSU, deep ball. And also the fact that your running backs are so good, if they can get to the second level, just looking at grades, which is a little bit redundant, but we're doing it more so for the sake of argument or trying to, I'd say, sponsor thoughts or instigate some thoughts more than anything else. Ohio State's running backs are very deadly when they get past the first level. If you don't stop them behind the line of scrimmage, they gain yardage typically. Or if you don't stop them within like 2 yards or 3 of the line of scrimmage, they could be gone. They're that good in open space. Meanwhile, Indiana's running backs are more power backs. They're always going to fall forward. TFLs are less likely to occur, I think, with IU's running backs and run game and offensive line than Ohio State's. But Ohio State's running backs are just so explosive. I mean, they get into the open field, one broken tackle, and they're gone. The good news for that, of course, is that Indiana tackles well. And we're going to go over something called the good, the meh, and the ugly. Good things about each team, neutral things that could be good or bad depending on what happens there, and also some pretty bad things, ugly things. The good for Indiana is they're fundamentally sound and minimize mistakes. They are elite at tackling and they have good pursuit on defense. They have a powerful speed rush from the defensive line. Their players have high football IQ, especially at defensive back, and they have good hands there, where they've had several interceptions. They've defended, Washington, it's a one-game sample size, but they cooked Washington's passing offense for much of that game, and I was impressed by that, because Washington has some receivers that, I don't know if any of them would start at OSU, but they would have a better chance starting at OSU than most receivers in the Big Ten, that's for sure. Denzel Boston is really good, and Giles Jackson, I think, has been developed well this year. They're physical and strong on the offensive line. Their average weight on the O-line, by the way, 313 pounds. Ohio State's average weight's like 314. So they're big, they're physical, their average height's like 6'5" on the O-line, and they're accurate and strong at quarterback with reliable receivers, which is a deadly combination. What I'm neutral on is, like I talked about, Indiana's a bunch of power backs. They're consistent, but they're not necessarily explosive. Even when they have space, like Justice Ellison had multiple times against Nebraska, they don't have that same home run hitter speed that Judkins or Henderson have. And the ugly for the Hoosiers is they commit bad penalties occasionally, more than OSU does, which is a disadvantage in this game. They're inconsistent at getting pressure without blitzes, without help from the linebackers. Their D-line only creates 74% of their total sacks. And they lack the lack of explosive wide receiver or running back to bust the game open could be killer when Ohio State has that capability, and you don't. OSU can score. Let's say they're pinned at their 10. They could score a 90-yard touchdown run if Indiana misses a tackle or if it's perfectly blocked. They could get a 90-yard TD pass. I don't know if Indiana can do that, and I'm going to lean on the side that they can't. Meanwhile, you look at Ohio State. The good for them is they have athletes everywhere. Boom. They can score at any time. They are elite at tackling and pursuit, I believe, in the secondary. And the linebackers are also smart. They generate pressure. And Will Howard, let me tell you something. Will Howard is one of the nation's better quarterbacks right now. Because you look at the elusiveness that he has. You look at his accuracy. You can clearly tell he is a veteran. I'm impressed by what he's done. Even factoring in his receivers that he has, he's done a phenomenal job. Like, he's had a good supporting cast, yes, but it's like J.J. McCarthy or Stetson Bennett, where separate that all out, he's still a very good quarterback. He can win Ohio State a national title, even with these injuries on the O-line, which definitely hurt them against a team like Ole Miss, or a team I think like Penn State in a rematch, or Oregon, or Indiana, or Georgia, or, Texas with Alfred Collins. The injury to McLaughlin hurts against those teams because they have either really good D tackles, really good D-lines overall. They can mess with you. But Howard is so good that it's not just Chip Kelly who can scheme around those bad things, those issues. Howard can play around them. He can negate them with his mobility, with his decision-making, his football IQ, his touch on the ball. I'm a big Will Howard fan. I've evolved into that throughout the year. The running backs are the full package. They compensate for the offensive line. And these receivers, I think particularly Jeremiah Smith, 54.68 seconds in the 400-meter hurdle in high school. He's probably faster now. They're all NFL caliber. The neutral for OSU is the defensive line is boom or bust in defending the run. I say that because compared to IU on film, and Jonah Coleman was able to expose some things for Indiana, that's for sure. And Coleman is the closest to Henderson and Judkins in terms of running backs that IU has faced. That's a concern for IU. Indiana has gotten better and better on defense throughout the year. OSU's gotten better on defense ever since that Nebraska game, but we also have to remember that Indiana, not Indiana. Ohio State has not faced a passing offense anywhere close to Oregon's, outside of Oregon. Indiana is the closest thing to Oregon that OSU is facing on their schedule, outside of Oregon. When you look at defensive profile, when you also look at, when you look at the passing offense in particular, the defensive profile, it's really just one player. It's the defensive tackle depth that both of those schools have. They're different in other things there. But the D-line for OSU, I think, is more boom or bust at stopping the run than Indiana is. And I think you've seen against Nebraska, we've seen against Oregon, and I think even a bit against Purdue and Northwestern early, who both don't have good offensive lines, that you can run on OSU. You can. I mean, their D-line is not elite. That's why they're blitzing. And they've benefited from turnover luck as well. OSU fumbles on average 1.2 times per game, but they only lose 25% of their fumbles per game. And against a team like Indiana, who's fundamentally sound, Indiana might recover all the fumbles OSU loses, and that could be a game breaker in what might be a close game. The ugly for OSU is the same as with Indiana. They are inconsistent without blitzes. Ohio State's defensive line only creates 57% of their total sacks. They basically have to blitz to get pressure. And it can work because their secondary can be that good, but it can also end in disaster. I mean, think of the Oregon game. In the second half, Ohio State blitzed more, and it did nothing for them. In fact, it helped Oregon extend their drives and create big plays. I mean, blitzing for OSU with Knowles, especially in 22, but even a little bit this year, has been very up and down. It's been very risk reward and at more extreme ends of the spectrum than I think they would like. So that's something. And the offensive line is missing 2 starters. The effect of that in totality is unknown. They could put on a good performance tomorrow. They could also completely fall apart. We'll just have to wait and see. That's an unknown, but an unknown in a big game is an ugly. 10 reasons why both teams can win, and then we'll get to my prediction and get on out of here. For Indiana, it's their elite coaching / plan. They're coming off of a bye week. It's an elite defensive line that features Kamara, that features CJ West, a tackle that they have who's over 300 pounds. Michigan wanted him. Indiana got him. It's players like James Carpenter, Tyreek Tucker, Linnell Carr Jr., Andrew Turvey. They're deep on the D-line. It's Curtis Rourke at 3, disciplined DBs at 4, a physical offensive line at 5, 3 yards in a cloud of dust, their ability to run consistently, convert on short yardage, keep you honest in the ground at 6. 7, a little bit repetitive. I think I meant to put in something else outside of elite coaching. Can't exactly think of it. 8 is a bend but don't break defense. Oh, I know what 7 was. 7 was 5 deep wide receiver. So ignore that. 5 deep wide receiver. Indiana has the deepest receiver core that OSU has seen since Oregon. Elijah Surratt, Miles Cross, Miles Price, Keshawn Williams, Omar Cooper Jr. all have significant snaps. All are highly graded, anywhere from good to even close to elite, and they can rotate. This wide receiver core will not get tired. They can rotate. They can attack you in a variety of different ways. Penn State has Harrison Wallace III, for example, who's good. Not great at wide receiver, just good. Indiana has 5 players that are at least his caliber, and several of them are probably better. 8 is the bend but don't break defense. Indiana's very good at this. Opponents love to go for it on 4th down against Indiana, and Indiana only allows their opponents to convert a fourth of their attempted 4th downs. They're very good at bend but don't break, and it's because they're so fundamentally sound. They're so disciplined. Number 9, pro-Ohio State rat poison. Most people are saying it's when, not if, Ohio State loses. So take from that what you will. And 10 is greater urgency. Indiana needs to win this game if they want to be guaranteed a playoff spot. Ohio State can lose this game and reach the playoff. For OSU, reason number 1 is their first-round wide receivers. Number 2 is Caleb Downs, Lathan Ransom, Jordan Hancock. Number 3 is Chip Kelly's schematics. 4th is Will Howard and everything he provides. 5th is their improving linebacker group. If they improve again in this game, big things can happen on defense. An elite running back duo at 6 that can compensate for some issues on the offensive line. Number 7's a high-octane D-line that if they step up and finally play to their A game, they'd be one of the best, if not the best D-line in the country. 8th is next man up on the offensive line. They've stepped up before against Penn State. Maybe they can step up again. 9th is a size advantage. They're slightly bigger at most positions compared to IU. Not enough to make a big difference, but collectively it could make a small difference, which is critical in a close game. And especially at defensive tackle, Ohio State is bigger and it's noticeable. And number 10, it's at the Horseshoe. Ohio State has a big home field advantage. They'll have 100,000 angry fans yelling at IU every time they take the field. That could have an effect on Indiana here. And finally, my revised prediction. I hate this. I'm not confident in it. I feel like something different is going to happen. That's really what it is. I've been back and forth. I was about to pick Indiana in my original video and then didn't because I went to bed, woke up, and I thought to myself, oh, OSU is a talent edge. And that was kind of the tiebreaker, was the talent edge, home field advantage. Then Seth McLaughlin gets hurt. And then I watch film against the Michigan game, and I thought to myself, that's Indiana's low. That's their worst game of the year, was what they had against Michigan. And it was better than Ohio State's worst game of the year against Nebraska. So Ohio State has the higher ceiling, yes. But consistency is where you are in the middle, or maybe a little bit below or a little bit below or above. And it's in between the range of your outcomes. One extreme on the other end, another extreme on the other. And both teams may just play the best game of the entire year. And at that point, you probably lean OSU. But they're both a little bit banged up. They are, especially on a position as important as the offensive line, and they're not without faults. None of these teams can be 2019 LSU. They can't. They're both incapable of being that good. They're not 2020 Bama. They are not 2001 Miami. They're just not. They can't be. OSU's opportunity to show they were that good was against Penn State, and they couldn't pull away. They couldn't. Penn State was hanging around in that game, and it didn't matter if Penn State was already dead or not. OSU couldn't. They couldn't pull away. The same thing with Nebraska. They couldn't pull away in a big way. Indiana couldn't against Michigan, but that's more so saying these teams are comparable than not. Ohio State has a talent edge. I know I'm taking a risk here with this pick, and I do think Ohio State outgains Indiana in offensive yards, but I think Indiana's better special teams unit, a good return unit, plus the fact I think they hold Ohio State to under 100 rushing yards and fewer than 4 yards per carry. They're going to put the game on Will Howard's back. I think Howard will perform well overall. I think Ohio State will get touchdowns. They will score. But I think that, look, Indiana's better with the turnover battle here. And they're better on the ground. And at the end of the day, that pushes me to pick the upset here. To go on the Chip Patterson train. To trust in Sig, I guess as they say, a little bit. And I think Indiana also controls the time of possession and eventually emerges. I could be wrong here. I picked OSU to win by 1 score in my preview and prediction video. It wouldn't shock me if OSU wins. In fact, they should be favored to win this game. And I don't think this loss here is anything about Ryan Day. I don't. I think he's a top 5 coach. I just think Cignetti's really good. And I think that Indiana analytically is showing themselves to be a powerhouse team this year, and that can't be ignored. People are ignoring that. Like, oh, well, weak strength of schedule. Yeah, even when you factor that in, they're a really, 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 really good team, and they have some matchup edges with OSU. If Indiana is patient, they can and will win, because they will take the 5 to 10 yards that OSU's corners will give them, the occasional big play. They will get the 3 yards in a cloud of dust. And if they can force OSU to be consistent, well, that's going to test OSU's patience, because OSU has scored on big plays pretty much all season long. So I'm fascinated to watch this game. OSU could win big. They could win close. Indiana can win close. I don't think Indiana can win in like a Michigan State 2021 type blowout like what OSU had, but they could probably win by double digits if enough things go their way. So I'm excited to watch this top 5 matchup. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all soon. Thank you to my Patreon members for sponsoring this video and channel. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Connor Low H for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, and Taylor Knight for being All-American members. Thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being All-Conference members. Check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Have a great day, everyone. Go Hoosiers, and go Buckeyes.